The research question, if you may see a few contradictions in different places because I've changed a few things about the research proposal. I took out the methods and results section, and I am changing how you think about the research question. So previously, the focus of the research question was on something that would work well for the methods and results sections. You need to be able to describe your populations very clearly, how you divide people into groups. You need to be able to measure things with a measure that you could describe in detail, and you needed to analyze it with a t-test. That is all very research methods focused, and so one thing that's come out of me, trying to hurriedly adapt and make things doable when I lost a week of class and everyone was overwhelmed due to the pandemic. But I've realized that it really let me focus more on the writing piece, which is how do you structure a literature review or an introduction in a way that logically leads to a research question. So, because when we were focused on the methods part, I would just say, okay, we're just going to pretend that it makes sense. We're not going to contort too hard. You don't have to rewrite your whole introduction. Here, I'm still going to say you don't need to rewrite your whole introduction, but I am going to say that I care a good bit about you creating a research question that's going to flow logically from what you've written in your introduction. So when you look at the template, the focus is on really, I say research question like it's interchangeable with hypothesis, but they are slightly different things. A research question is an open-ended, so it's a is or does kind of question, like do men and women do differently at a particular task? A hypothesis is a prediction. So you are making some statement, and it might just be men and women will have different scores on something. But you could also predict that a certain group will have higher scores, rates, whatever. So a hypothesis is making a specific prediction. You still need to identify your prediction, your predictor variable, and your outcome variable. So if let me see, I have some suggestions down here. Do older adults, let's say show, or maybe report. Do older adults report more symptoms of trauma than younger adults? So our predictor is clearly age. And in this case, I'm using scores on a particular measure. Now that's the level of detail that I'm not requiring you to do anymore. I also used to require extremely simple questions that fit one particular format because I wanted you to be able to write about the stats, which meant I wanted you to write something that would fit the format I had to give you for the stats. You can have a little more flexibility with how you ask the question now because I'm not asking you to talk about measurement. However, I still am going to push for you to keep it to be a pretty simple question because whatever you write about here, you have to talk about in your discussion section. So even though you don't have to explain a lot of the details of how you would measure something, you still do need to be able to talk clearly about how it relates to the literature, what it might mean, and the simpler you go, the easier that's going to be. I want you to learn these skills in a simplified format so then when you move forward, you have a sense of how to go through and structure things. So in this template, I try to give some ideas of different ways to ask questions, but really you just need to write a hypothesis, typically about how two groups are going to be different. It could be groups that are already different, like I mentioned, men and women. You could also look at people who are college educated versus not college educated. You could also look at people who score high on a measure of something versus low on that measure. So people with high extroversion will have more email follow-ups after a career networking event. So that would be something where level of extroversion would be the predictor. Number of emails after a networking event would be the outcome. Still be aware as you are thinking about groups, be aware of the bias and how you divide group. I've used men and women a couple times as an example. There are people who don't identify as either male or female. And so people who are non-binary or intersex may be completely excluded from something that focuses on men versus women. And people who are transgender may not, it may not be clear which category you are identifying them as being in, and so they may also be excluded. Um, so when you are thinking about things like if you want to compare different racial groups, different religious groups, different gender groups, um, just be aware of the bias that may be involved there, and if you do it, make sure you kind of have a reason why you're choosing that group that you can explain. The present study paragraph is going to act as a bridge between your introduction and your research question. And so there you can kind of explain your rationale for why you're choosing this as an important group to study. With this, my expectations for flow from your introduction are going to be much higher. So I want you to think about what are the limitations that you see in the research, what are the main points that you're emphasizing already in your introduction, and what direction do you seem to be going? So really look at your thesis statement from your literature review and think about where the research question is in that. I'm not asking you to necessarily rewrite your entire introduction to cater to the research question you end up doing. And I acknowledge that if you started out planning your research question, you might have structured your literature review or introduction differently. At the same time, I need to teach skills in a particular order, and so I would rather you have a slightly less than ideal research question for your interests and have it fit the flow of how you organized everything in your introduction. So it's a little bit of a back and forth process. I'm starting off this video with the same place where you're planning your outlines. So hopefully you are starting to think about what your research question might be as you're deciding what to really emphasize in your paper. If you feel stuck on a research question, you can feel free to email me. This is definitely one of those spots where, a short meeting with me may save you hours and hours of frustration. And also, if your research question is wonky, it can make it a lot harder to do other steps like the present study or your revised discussion. So you really want to make sure that you've got that ironed out. And after you submit it, even if you have full points, I want you to check very carefully to see if I have given you an updated wording. I may say, yeah, your question's great, I'll give you points, but here's the wording you need to use. And so be very careful to follow that. I think that's it, but if you have any questions, feel free to email me, leave a comment on YouTube, any of the above. Thanks. Bye.